The difference between our preliminary task and our final piece was we did a change from continuity editing to montage. In our preliminary task, the shots were much longer, we had a slower cutting rate, and we used much less storyboarding because of this. However, for our final piece, we had a faster cutting rate, a large variety of locations, and different sizes of clips. In response, we had to do a lot more storyboarding, which took up a lot of our time. There was also a change from red wash to black and white. In our preliminary task, we were looking at films like Vertigo by Alfred Hitchcock and the iconography of red, and it's given the impression of danger. So we wanted to go something along those lines to make our piece look more sinister, so we tried that out. However, with our final piece, we decided a black and white look would be much better. We looked at Silent Hill and thought it gave a nice artistic look to it. It allows us to bring out the colour red still and focus in on it. Like, we used red in our titles and we picked out red using colour pass in one of our scenes. With our music, in our preliminary task, our music was ready-made, simply placed in without any thought from the school's computer. However, with the final piece, we actually went into a studio and made it ourselves at Blizzard Records. It took a long time to make, but it's definitely worth it. We used a number of different tracks. We recorded ourselves screwing up paper, ourselves singing, laughing, and us scratching up metal, and we thought that worked really well. We used a different software for this called Pro Tools, and it was hard to get to grips with that, but after the first day it was very easy and we got on track to making a very good soundtrack. With our titles in the preliminary task, they were very plain, just white, and they tracked up like in the Star Wars films. However, with our final piece, we wanted to do something a lot more interesting. We used the colour red to add a colour to our otherwise black and white piece, which was our highlight colour. The only colour we featured in our video was red. We added movement to our text and a fade out between the transitions. The effects that we used on our preliminary task was a red wash using Channel Mixer. We used basic continuity editing. However, with our final piece, we were a lot more creative and managed to use a larger variety of effects. We added black and white onto all of our clips, brightness and contrast, so we made sure the black and white looked really effective. We used a 4-point garbage mat, which we used to create the girl looking in the mirror. As she turns around, her reflection is still there. We used colour pass in one of our black and white images to pick out the red on the wall, which we thought worked really well. We used an old effect on our film to create the idea of a flashback. It made the images look damaged, added a static effect. We used expansion and compression of time. A lot of our pieces were very long and slow, so we wanted to speed them up, and it allowed us to add more footage into our final piece. For our camera work in the preliminary task, it was all at eye level, it followed one line of motion, and this is all needed in continuity editing. We used the 180-degree rule, which is what we had to use, but however, with our final piece, because there was only one character, we did not need to follow these rules for a conversation. We used a large variety of angles for each of our locations in our final piece to give nice effect. So for our preliminary task, we chose psychological thriller as our genre. We used a tap as one of our props. We were restricted by doing our piece in the school for lack of props available, and our costume, it was hard to do because we were coming into school on different days and we were changing our clothes. The room was a small space and it was hard to film in, there's little movement for the camera. And for our final piece, we chose another psychological thriller for our genre. Our costume, we used a little girl's dress. For our props, we used dolls, scissors and paint. We were restricted by the weather as some of our locations were open, and time was a restriction because we had so much footage that we wanted to get through in so little time to do it in. For our preliminary task, we used Wilderness Woods as a recce to help us build on knowledge. It helped us to get to grips with using the camera and using the editing software Premiere. We wrote a script for this and thought out some possible shots that we wanted to experiment with. For our final piece, we did our own location recce. We went to Riverhead and we went to a churchyard and took some stills and filmed some dolls in the graveyard. We were able to use more experimental shots with our own recce. It helped us to build ideas for our final piece. The strengths in our preliminary task were our continuity editing. However, we lacked experience, so it wasn't all good in all of our areas. We used the colour pass, which worked particularly well, adding red onto our piece. The weaknesses of our preliminary task were it wasn't very thought out. We didn't have a lot of time and the narrative was a bit skew with. It was unclear what was going on and it didn't have a strong line of action. The titles were very basic. We didn't add any effects onto it, just simple text. With our final piece, the strengths were our sound. We spent a lot of time creating the sound. It's unique, no one else will have sound like it, and we thought it worked really well how we could edit it exactly to our piece. The montage editing in our final piece worked really well. We could use a fast cutting rate, a mixture of stills and footage. We liked the red colour that we picked out using colour fast. That worked really well. We had a nice variety of effects that showed our creativity and how well we can work using that software. With our locations, we used a nice variety which helped with our mise en scène. We used ruins, a school, a playground and a churchyard. Now for the weaknesses. With our final piece, the titles were quite rushed at the end. We didn't have enough time to edit them fully, but we thought they did all right. Our montage with our narrative, it was unclear to some of our audience. However, we tried to edit it again so it was more understandable because it was unclear to some.